We'll start our presentation now as it's 5 past. There will be other people entering. I'm sure they won't disturb us. So welcome everybody. My name is Indra Adnan, and I'm the co-initiator of the Alternative UK, which is a new political platform. Well, we've been going for about 3 years, and we've existed to answer the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And I'd just like to introduce my co-initiator, Pat Kane. Perhaps you'd like to say hello, Pat. Oh, Pat, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, here we go. Hi everyone, Pat Kane, co-initiator with Indra of this fine project, the Alternative UK. I'm a journalist, curator, writer, musician, postmodern jack of all trades.
And we're very, very pleased and honoured to be part of this project, Catalyst 2030, which has been recently pulled together, a group of NGOs and social enterprise people from all over the globe, who have come together to committed ourselves to somehow reaching the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, something that until recently people have felt is not possible, and it's still a huge target, but that's our focused commitment between us. So what we're planning to do here today is to talk about the missing infrastructure on the ground. And it's a very broad idea that, in a sense, the solutions to the Sustainable Development Goals are already present on the globe. We have the, we have the capability. We even have the structures available. But for some reason, we still don't have the uptake from the majority of the people. If the people are not using the tools and the insights and the structures that have been designed by others to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, we are not going to reach our targets. And so this presentation is really about how we've been trying to move the solutions to the people on the ground. So Pat, would you like to move to the next slide?
Oh, wrong one. Here we go. There.
So the Alternative UK is a whole system people power project. And as you know, people power has had varying kinds of reputation in the past. And it's something that sometimes scares people and sometimes enlivens people. But our sense is that unless we can find our collective agency to really think about the people as the solution rather than the problem that we need to solve, we're not going to be able to meet our targets. So everything that we're doing at the Alternative UK is premised on the idea that seeing the human being at the heart of our system as the thing that needs to find its agency is the solution to our problems. How can we creatively connect the energy on the ground to the global sphere? Next slide, please, Pat.
Okay, so we're going to talk about three methods of developing people to a situation where they can grasp those tools to attain the development goals. Again, stressing the point I made before is that when we talk about people or the popular or maybe even populism, this isn't just a burden or a problematic, as it's often described in recent discourse. The people are our greatest resource, and I think there's a sort of a shift towards realizing that human potential, which, if it was properly done, would change an awful lot of how we do policy and infrastructure and initiatives. The other developmental method would be a question of narrative. And I think this is becoming almost a common sense amongst change makers, but and to some extent in the popular realm, people talking about fake news and post-truth and so forth. But it's a simple message. The story we tell shapes our behaviour at every level, and that behaviour makes a different reality if it's properly motivated from the one that exists. And then the third developmental method would be to try to think about whole system change, which is a statement of ambition about how much you think the structures around you can change. But our gambit and actually our growing experience is that if we look at self-organisation at the neighbourhood level, and in this amplified, networked age, it's very possible that self-organisation at that level can change the shape and the direction of world trends and world forces as a result of the tools we have at our hand and our disposal, and maybe other cultural shifts as well. So those are the three ways into which we think that the gap between citizen action and the development goals could be closed. I'll go on to the next slide, Indra.
Yep, thank you. So this is just to emphasize again the sense that many of the axes in Catalyst 2030 have developed resources and methods of communication, institutions, organizations that are capable of moving energy and capability at very high levels. But the real problem that we haven't been able to solve is how to reach the people on the ground. Now, many people will say, of course, we've been very successful in many ways at giving aid or being able to send resources to people, but we haven't yet really developed the means to give agency to the people themselves on the ground so that they can reach for the things that they themselves know best that they need. So paying attention or bringing attention to developing the agency of each individual and how those individuals connect to each other is our focus. Next slide, Ben.
Sure. So how do we engender the conditions in which people can receive invitations to raise their game as citizens, to widen their perspectives, to focus their actions? And we're all hoping that the COVID space and time is something in which we can get at people to do that. But three conditions for being receptive to this. One, trust, incredibly important. It's been a narrative, it's been a theme of the last 10, 15 years that there's a decline in trust in official occupations, establishments, institutions. So it has to be re-established, even more so in the current circumstance. And how do we do that? Well, our guess is that certainly shared narrative has to be built. Relationships, real, tangible, not just virtual, face-to-face, but now obviously having to be face-to-face plus virtual relationships have to be forged. And a sense of mutuality. And I think what's been really interesting, we'll talk about this later, is the way that the word mutual in terms of mutual aid has come through the current COVID crisis. We'll talk about that later on, but trust, very, very essential condition for being receptive to raising your game as a citizen. Structure is a big word, but what we're focusing on here is how network society can enable the connection of people to each other, but also from the local to the global. The old phrase 10 years ago was, you know the face of your neighbour less well than you know the face of Nelson Mandela. Well, now, as a result of globalisation and networks and the crisis that we're in, we're actually able to return to the local with greater power and with greater information and greater informedness, and an appetite to self-organise. And then the final one would be responsibility, which we break into responsibility. And by that we mean not in all these great grand schemes, remotely forgetting personal capacity and also personal agency. it's incredibly important to remember that, and to remember that people, as a consequence of the society that we're living in, have an expanded sense of agency and the tools to express themselves through that, and maybe also the growing psychological literacy to fuel that. So those are our three conditions.
So I
Yeah.
just wanted to reverse order those slightly, and see the relationship between the development of responsibility in the human being. So ability to respond is also developing their agency. We call that the development of I. The development of structure, how each human being moves into relationship with their community, sometimes virtual communities, but most importantly, the community on the ground. We describe that as we. And the third part really is the story that we're telling about each other and the story that we're telling about the world. This interrelatedness and mutual inclusion of relationship is absolutely key to the change that we wish to see. And we describe this as the I-we world axis of change. So how those three things work together is really how we see whole system change happening. Thank you. So next slide, Pat. So in addition to that, the importance of containers to develop these conditions of growth has become more and more crucial. So certainly we would say that the revolution in relationship has been happening for over 20 years since the birth of the internet. We've all been able to be more connected to each other, we've been able to be more connected to knowledge. We've been able to mobilize. But in some senses, to be able to do that over the whole of the internet has not really delivered the results we're looking for, as those ties are usually very weak, and relationships are not strong enough to cause development to happen. So we're talking now about the importance of containers, small enough groups of people in which meaningful relationship can occur, and in which belonging and meaning and purpose can be grown. So these containers are, in a sense, the new element in our idea of how a globe becomes connected. So for individual development to happen, we know that it's not a question simply of having a roof over our head and food in our stomachs. Material needs are, of course, very important, but we now know better than ever that emotional needs, people having their emotional needs met or expressing their emotional needs, can make all the difference to the success of a community or to the destruction of that community. If we don't have the containers within which these relationships can be developed, we won't be able to grow the community as a safe place. In developing socially, we have understood, and I think this is a lesson that's been learned all over the world, that diversity is not only important for inclusion, it's also important for the richness of a project and its ability to hold full system development. And then the last point about cosmo-local development. Sometimes when people think about bottom-up organization, or they think about the grassroots, sometimes they think that it's a small or shallow project, which has no connection at all to the globe. But increasingly, the possibility of what we call cosmo-local development, how we bring all the best of the global community to the system that's existing on the ground, is increasingly how we do how we're able to grow. Over to the next slide, Pat.
Okay. Well, we've sort of prepared one earlier in terms of talking about a container for that level of complex functionality and sort of people power. What is the kind of container we're talking about? Well, we call our version of it, and others might have theirs, is called a Citizen Action Network, a CAN, which is the kind of obvious pun, but quite a powerful metaphorical way to talk about it. So what's in a CAN? What's in a Citizen Action Network? Well, primarily, there has to be tools and spaces for relationship building. How we've done this in our own practice is we have been called out by vibrant localist communities to our website, thealternative.co.uk. They've pulled us in. They've asked us to address questions about agency locally, and then we've started to open up these tools and spaces for relationship building, which is often enabled by fascinating casts of characters, everybody from local businessmen to social enterprise people to activists. But we seem to be able to chime with people who want to open up their communities to a different kind of functionality, using space and place in different ways. Another element of a Citizens Action Network, which is kind of a shimmering structure at the moment, but it's filled with very concrete things. Secondly, is learning for 21st century life. There's an obvious educational agenda to be had from facing the crises of the 21st century, whether that's climate crisis or automation or now pandemic. There needs to be a kind of a culture of learning instituted at the community level. That's the kind of thing a Citizens Action Network would foment. Creating your own media so that new narratives can be promulgated through those communities, incredibly important. It hardly needs to be overstated, the power of the mainstream media, and it hardly needs to be overstated the necessary counterpower of shaping a different story about your reality such that it can be a different reality and you can act in it in a different way, whether more optimistically or in a more detailed way, in a way that's less transfixed by the if it bleeds, it leads approach to mainstream media. Citizen Action Networks can also be ambitious about sharing structures, for example, certainly around sustainable power, small grids. There's so many ideas flow into the alternative from all over the place about suggestions about the subsidiarity and devolution of infrastructures around power and also food to the locality. So that's again something that could be a container could be built for that doesn't quite exist properly at the moment between local governments and markets and state. New forms of currency. The idea that you can sophisticatedly value activity in your community. Cryptocurrency and blockchain is beginning to give us a sense of what the infrastructures of that would be, but effectively we're beginning to kind of see it in the COVID moment. People are creating networks of care that are able to organize people to give value to each other on the level of just looking after each other. So that's possible. And quite crucially, and we use the word deliberately, joy, how can we grab the emotional ground in a crisis-torn situation and tend it towards the joy and optimism and delight of being with others and acting in a concerted way through arts, games and imagination, rather than allowing our buttons to be constantly pressed by the Cambridge Analyticas, the political technologists, the political marketers, who seem to have seized so much of the process of change in our public lives. Let's try and seize that back, but let's try and think of new structures and ways to do that and to link that to social action. And again, that is something else that goes into the container of what we're calling a Citizen Action Network.
So I'd just like to draw attention to our current political system, which looks at local communities simply as either people who join the party or people who will knock on doors of others to get them to vote once every 4 or 5 years. That's the only way that citizens currently can link directly to power. So this is quite a shift of the idea of what our democracy could be, that people can move together into relationship with each other. They find their resources within that Citizens Action Network, and that means resources not only for possible ways of in the future sharing food and energy, but more importantly, the resources of belonging and meaning and purpose, creating shared narratives, and being able to look at the world in a completely different way from where they are. This is the kind of fertile ground that we believe will create a whole new way of being receptive to the Sustainable Development Goals. as people see their own relationship between themselves, their community, and the planetary boundaries, they will be empowered in the sense to make decisions for themselves about how they go forward into the future. The idea from there is that CANS would have a partnership, if you like, a partnership arrangement with the local council, where the local council can agree to do some of the things for that community, and the community in turn will give the council a much better sense of what is needed and what is possible from the people who live there. Next slide, please.
Yourself and
Yeah. So after 3 years of really looking and observing and seeing what is possible around the UK and how we've been working with the people who've been maybe planning for decades to improve the quality of the lives of the people that they live amongst, we focused on 3 things that we tried to deliver to enhance the work of the people that's, as I say, been going on for decades. So the first thing we do is that we've developed a daily alternative media channel. This was absolutely vital, as Pat mentioned earlier, in the light of the fact that only 2% of people are members of political parties, but the mainstream discourse around power is coming from that 2%. So we felt it was very important to develop our own media narrative. I think you've gone too far, Pat. If you can go back to the slide. Should be able to develop our own media narrative so that people are become increasingly aware that the solutions to the problems that they're seeking are already there. So every day we are reporting on the sorts of things that the Catalyst 2030 members have been doing, not only all over the globe, but also locally. So people have a sense that there is a future to move into. So this is very crucial. The second thing we've been doing is working and driving collaboration between people in the system who we feel are giving rise to a whole new social, economic, political system. And the third thing that we're doing is building citizens' action networks. Next slide.
yes. So when we look at all this in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, we found ourselves in a very interesting situation, because the kind of focus on empowered citizens from the bottom up, finding a way to care for themselves and provision for themselves at that local level, is something we find ourselves already fashioning the tools for, and have been doing so for the last 3 years, post-Brexit and post that particular crisis of politics. And certainly, one of the points that can be made about COVID-19 is that it is it's brought to a head various crises of agency that we've just been talking about, and certainly that is one of our insights, I think, that we can bring to this particular moment in 2020, which is a kind of realization that we need a richer model of everyday citizenship in the face of Brexits and Trumps and populisms and so forth. We've been talking about that sophisticated relationship and talking to communities about it as a relationship between IWE and world, as Indra mentioned before. And we're sort of crisis ready, as it were, and we're interested in prototyping and testing and fashioning innovative ways to strengthen citizens' responses to an extremely demanding and accelerating world. And we talk about the Cosmo Local. That's maybe a bit of a new concept, but it's actually happening on the ground. 3D printers being sourced from Czech plans and built in Italy. But it's also a bit of an ideal about how localities can be open-minded and globalist by virtue of the technology, rather than defensive and narrow-minded. And we're not just placing a bet on that, we're seeing that actually happen. And I think the COVID-19 crisis has actually provided some optimism on that count, I think we could say. Andrew?
Yeah, next slide, thank you. So in the UK, we had a very slow and confused response to COVID to start with. But we noticed three things, even in those early days. First of all, that social media delivered very different facts and stories about COVID. And the government, in a sense, asked us to wait and see what they felt the response should be. But in fact, many institutions and many people already in contact and already reading about what was happening around the world made their own decisions ahead of the government. So there was a sense and there was some evidence that a new sense of agency and authority is already arising and in fact accelerating at this time. The second thing that we noticed was that working from home has opened up or made really obvious to all of us. We're all observing the divide between the people who are suddenly professing how much time and space and calm they're experiencing from this COVID crisis, and those who absolutely have no time are under much more pressure than before and are being relied upon. So the divide, which somehow might have been less obvious from our mainstream media, has become something that we're all observing and acknowledging together. And the state has not really been able to offer help from the center to the people on the ground. What's been happening instead is immense amounts of mutual aid occurring from the bottom up. Neighbourhood networks that were not there before have sprung up all over the country in their hundreds of thousands. This is, for us, real evidence that the thing that we've been wishing and, in a sense, preparing us for is the thing that can happen now in this age at this time, and will help us towards the agency that we're really seeking over the next years. Pat, next slide. We're nearly finished, and we're going to move into conversation in a moment.
Yeah. So our suggestion is that one of the labours that we need to be involved in is the conscious construction of a new story about ourselves, the system, and the world that we're in, and that David Bollier, the Commons expert, calls us an onto shift, and what it means is an ontological shift, a new conception of reality that's narrated into being, that's built into being by practice, and which then changes things if we are out of the standard reality frame as defined by current establishments and the powers that be. So what happens if you change that story? We get various heightened senses, certainly of our own vulnerability, and sometimes that can be brilliant in terms of dethroning existing forms and discourses of power, whether that's patriarchal or northern hemispheric or whatever. Vulnerability is when it's collective, and if it can be seized, it can be a way to collectively strengthen our conditions of security. But that has to be seized. Other people could seize it and turn it towards entirely different ends. Secondly, we have a heightened sense as a result of COVID and as a result of the consequences, the cascade of crises that we're in, is that we are reliant on the labour of the worst paid. What is called the foundational economy is something we've suddenly realised we're standing on the shoulders of, and that will have quite profound consequences for how we think about the communities that we're in and who is of value in those communities. And again, just to make the obvious point, but it needs to be made, is that the other heightened sense we have is of the dangerous consequences of our exploitative relationship with the natural world. We've just come out of about a year of Extinction Rebellion commanding streets and climate strikers populating the thoroughfares and presenting messages to elites that their behaviour has to change. But it's a bug in our skin, released from an agribusiness tearing lumps out of forests in other parts of the world that then travels all the way to where we are. It's that experience, that biological experience, which COVID has brought to an absolute peak. And it's also brought to a peak our ambition for changing the structures that make that possible. So the story is there to be forged, but it's being forged at very febrile conditions. But that means to say we redouble our ambition as framers and narrators and systems builders and structures creators, because we could certainly move on some of the politics about living well on this planet that many of us have been pursuing over many years. We could definitively move on that at this moment in time. Okay, shall I go on? Next slide, Andrew.
So since lockdown, the Alternative has developed three key tools. We've been increasing our online discussion events and introducing to our audiences what we call key systems thinkers. We've been developing online collaboratories, helping newly organized neighborhood and town networks begin to future in a new way. And we've also developed our own app called Before and Now, in which we help individuals, anybody who picks up the app or downloads it on their phone or onto their piece of tech, to try to capture what it is that they are feeling and experiencing during this COVID crisis. In a way, all we've been doing is doing the same thing that we've been doing up to the COVID crisis. We found ourselves quite well prepared for a new public that is not sure of what we've lost and what we could be going towards. Everybody talks about a new normal, but nobody knows yet what that's going to be. For some, this has been a moment of revelation and even exploration into the future. And we're hoping that people, and we're offering people the tools to think positively and constructively forward. Next slide, Pat. So this is really the bit, this is the part of the session where we would go back to you, perhaps ask you for your comments on what we've said so far, encourage any questions. But also, if any of you there are willing to work with us in the future towards developing these things that we've been developing, or to partner with us in any way, or to share resources, maybe you're already doing some very similar work. But this is really the point where we'd like to hear from you. Pat, Pat, perhaps you'd like to stop sharing our document now, and I'll take back or in fact, we can all see each other, so that's fine. If anybody would like to either make a comment or ask a question, now's the time. Just raise your hand and we'll be able to call on you. Yeah, Wes, please go ahead. If you'd like to unmute yourselves, that'd be ideal. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I was just going to comment, which is, this is the first 2030 event I've attended. I didn't know there was a full itinerary of events today. So I'm sorry to have just caught up with who you are and where you are, but I'll do my best to keep on following you guys. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Great. Okay. Anybody else like to? If nobody else is, I'd like to invite Nate, actually. Unless, Steve, you'd just like to go first there, and afterwards I might invite Nate to talk a little bit about neighborocracy and the other kinds of citizens action networks that are already appearing across the world. But Steve, please go ahead.
Yeah, just a few things spring to mind when I was watching the presentation, just looking at your website as well. There's other models that have similarity to what I'm hearing. So there's something called the Climate Action Network. I don't know whether you're familiar with that, and Citizen Climate. It is a similar moniker, but they have a model to scale it with different chapters around the world, and also transition towns. Mm-hmm. Again, not the same as what I'm hearing, but with some similarity. And I think, it's interesting to look at the messaging and look at the objective of the organization, and understand what are the quick wins and what's the long-term vision, and the plan to get there. And that isn't, if I'm honest, quite as clear as I think it really needs to be, in terms of the simplicity, because there's an awful lot of information that you've just covered, and I put my hands up, with what I'm doing, and I get that wrong all the time. I'm working to try and create a sustainable development bank that can ultimately fund projects around the world that are involved in all of the SDGs, both through funds it creates that are quite innovative, but also through platforms it creates or invests in as well. And and it's been a long time coming. I think my view is an awful lot of the symptoms that we're seeing come out of unbalanced economies. Ultimately, we need economies to work. We need them to be healthy for people and planet. And for lots of reasons, capital has not been going to where it's needed to deliver that end. So, in terms of the political process, there's so many people who, and I'm one of them, hates it with a disdain that's really, pretty extreme right now, because, ultimately people are divided on so many levels. People are not open to natural agreement, and saying this is a political organization, does potentially alienate some of those people that you want to win over. If it's about community efficiency, community building, if it's about, a think tank, is it a action organization? What is it? I think really has to, and I'm sure you've wrestled with these issues in your development, and I'll commend you, because what I'm looking at seems impressive. It just needs a little bit of polish, I think, and bringing it together with those sort of, real things that are explicit and prioritized, and also sort of respecting the fact that 98% of people, very few of them will change because of what you're seeking to do. If a handful do, great. But, what is the wider objective that might catalyze that greater engagement and that greater understanding? So I think it's also really, really important to be kind of explicit with what you believe you can do and what you believe you can potentially catalyze. And ultimately messaging is very, very important, as you've said, with your media aspirations and media activity. So again, it's a question of what's the business model, to use a term that some of you might not like, but there has to be a model to, generate revenue and generate the content and pull it together and ensure it's, seen by the widest possible audience and engage with, and ultimately, what does that look like? So I'm just curious, these are just kind of questions and points. It's not,
No.
And I'm trying to be constructive.
No, and that's fine. And if you allow, almost all the questions that you've brought up are definitely ones that we've been engaging with. And it would be lovely to think, I know in the past, because I was part of a political party and I stood to be an MP, and I know that in the past, the obvious solution would be to form a party and get everybody to follow, right? Form a party, have a manifesto, get the people on board. It seems like a simple, straightforward response. But what we have discovered, over the last couple of decades, is that parties are very dysfunctional. They don't give power to the people. It's almost contrary to people power. And yet, when you talk to people in the places where they live or in the problems that they're experiencing, they will almost always come back to what's the politics of this? If you're not involved in politics, you won't have any power. So we're living in this paradox of politics has the power, politics has no power, right? So that's exactly, and you've rightly, identified the paradox within which we're trying to find new alternatives. So over the 3 years that we've been exploring the problem and really diving into, over that period, in the UK, we were post-Brexit, and we knew that we were living mostly in divided communities. And the problem with divided communities is that people remain vulnerable. And if they're vulnerable, they're easy to harness. And that is our political reality, right? That people are easy to harness emotionally, and that's what happens. So in a way, by not engaging with the people, we're leaving them to that fate, right? So our understanding was, number one, we have to engage on the ground with the people, create conditions for them to move into relationship with each other, build trust. That's the basis of a citizens' action network. Find agency in that container, right? And then start to bring down, through the cosmo-local possibilities that we have now through technology, the solutions that are available. So this is the thing that we developed as an understanding. Very difficult to convey in a short amount of time, unless you're using metaphor and narrative. So you're basically telling a different story about people power, and slowly you're drawing them towards the vehicles that could help them to engage and to operationalize their people power. So I don't know if you see that that's like a process that has to start with attraction. So it's soft power. You attract people into the space, and slowly you show them the tools that they have. So absolutely transition towns, absolutely climate action network. Our idea is to move into relationship with all of these different generically termed citizens action networks, so that we can all see that we're trying to do the same thing, exactly what you described. But at some point, that convergence hasn't been happening. That is also a problem of structure, the culture of working in silos. Some of it is to do with the gender divide and the lack of diversity in these spaces. There's many problems with it, but what you've pointed at is exactly what we're trying to do, and exactly what we're trying to get at. And even the fact that you pointed it is kind of evidence for us that it's time to do that, and it's possible to do that. But we do need a lot more people on board to do it together with us. Pat, you wanted to say?
Yes, it is just to say, Steve, that there are possibilities for political action that are not quite degraded. We cite people, transition towns excuse politics, says we're not going to be involved in politics, but flat pack democracy coming out of Frome and their ways of working is an attempt to use the power of locality to completely revive a sense of the civic and the public, and to very much be eclectic about what feeds into that. So no one really knows what the ideological position of someone is in a flat pack democratic council, but they come together to agree joint and common endeavours that can be realised, and the more that these endeavours are realised, often amplified by technology or by knowledge, by knowledge input, the more revivified people's sense of citizenship becomes. And also we heard something the other day about a woman who was getting very enthusiastic in Plymouth about neighbourhood forums. And that's a kind of drift down from the centre of localist legislation, whereby a neighbourhood can say, we want to have a say on a development that happens in our area. It's cast as a defensive legislation, but these people want to use it as proactive legislation, i.e. how can we use this forum to bring in policies on food, policies on energy, policies on housing, policies on property. But the idea that that's a valuable zone for politics isn't just parochialism, isn't just NIMBYism, not in my backyard. I mean, it can be BIMBYism, beautiful in my backyard as well. And the technology and the media and the tools are there to enable communities to punch way above their weight, to use a terrible metaphor. I don't like it, but I just used it. So how that relates to other levels of representation, or maybe in a far off sense, constitutional reform, federalism, subsidiarity, all those kinds of things. We're veterans of going through, and you can hear I'm Scottish, veterans of going through top-down constitutional change. It would be much better if the top-down met the bottom-up on the way up, and that people had a Citizens Action Network as a kind of prototype experiment space for figuring out new forms of democracy, voice, and action. And so we're as interested to talk to theatre companies and arts organisations in terms of the way that they bring people together to do stuff, as much as we are local enterprise agencies or entrepreneurs or whatever. To me, those are links to be made there. Sorry, Steve, on you go.
I know there's other people who want to talk and there's not much time left, but just very quickly, you know, what I see you're potentially doing is joining the dots, and I like the concept very much of enabling, you know, bottom up and top down to meet. And there's a organic way of doing that. You know, the more organic, the more natural it can become, the better. You know, and you know, things like Transition Towns and Climate Action Network. You know, one of the frustrations I've had is these things, you know, reach a frustrating ceiling, you know, and they cannot scale above that ceiling. And it really comes down to, I mean, using a business metaphor, it is the organization, it's the model, it's the, you know, the ambition sometimes, you know, and the funding mechanisms that enable it to essentially operate at the scale that's required. Have you actually heard of public.io? A guy called Daniel Korsky. I saw on your advisors or founders, you got Indy Johar, and I think Indy might know Daniel, but Daniel Korsky used to advise Tony Blair, I think, and they've created this thing which is like we bring together experience from the public sector, technology and finance to help startups solve public problems. So I don't know whether that's only for-profit entities or hybrids, but I would suggest you take a look at them if you don't know them, because A, they care about the subject matter, and B, they have a range of applicants and networks, and they're in a building on Northumberland Avenue, just at the close to the Thames. So they've got like a co-working space. So I'll shut up now. I'm recovering from COVID. That's why I'm being coughing. So it's 5 weeks in and finally feeling better. So I can function.
Oh, well, thank God.
Hence why I was not going to do my video. But anyway, here we are.
Good to have you on our call, Steve.
But thanks for this. It's really interesting.
No, thank you.
Right.
I would just quickly like to invite Nate to talk about your work, Nate, with the Neighbourhood Parliaments and so on, and just give a brief response, if you could, at how, you know, how it is a global movement and there is possibilities of all of us linking up.
Yeah, well, you know, I want to say, first of all, that actually I see you two, Indra and Pat, as being key players in linking all of these different networks. And so, you know, those of you who are on the call that don't know these two very well yet, and if you're interested in those things all connecting, stay in touch with these two and help them make the connections. Because yes, Transition Towns and Climate Action Networks and everything else too. The Neighbourhood Parliaments, if you want to get a lot more than I'm going to do in the next 2 minutes, you could go on their site. They've got a recording of a recent conversation we had with some of the kind of most active proponents of the Neighbourhood Parliament movement on the alternative.org.uk. But what the heck does that mean, Neighbourhood Parliaments? Basically, Neighbourhood Parliaments are, it's a way that neighbourhoods organize themselves. It emerged in India about 30 years ago, and it has grown to be one of the world's largest local chapter organizations, with more than 400,000 chapters in India, and has started to spread worldwide in northern Nigeria and different places in Latin America and Europe. and I'm working with some of those folks. I come to this originally in the 90s through my engagement with the Eco-Village movement, another one of these networks, movements. And more recently, I brought sociocracy to the UK. So if you're into sociocracy, hello. But so the sociocracy is a form of governance that has spread worldwide. It's been adopted. It was adopted by the Neighbourhood Parliaments movement about 10 years ago. And the reason this is relevant to the thing you were talking about, Steve, is that sociocracy gives a form of organizing that is both bottom up and top down. And it's fractal, so you can have the same organizing pattern appear on multiple levels, which makes it very accessible, so that once somebody has learned how to engage in a sociocratic system in their neighborhood, if they're elected up the organizational structure, they'll be familiar with the dynamics and how to engage effectively at every level, even if they are sort of at the national or international level of organizing. And those levels have been brought in the Neighbourhood Parliaments movement in India and are now just starting to come into being worldwide. And we're in the process of integrating these different movements, networks, organizations, hopefully in a profoundly participatory way, which is good for people, planet, and profit. That's like super quick. I've left so much out. I hope that's useful.
Thank you. I mean, it's for me, it was actually within this Catalyst 2030 community that I was beginning to hear and experience the worries about what would happen in India and different parts of Africa when people were being asked to go back to their villages where there were not even the ability for running water and space to be able to self-isolate and so on. And I really experienced, as I have many times before, this sense that when we think about so many vulnerable people, we're always thinking about how we can help the people, which is a great part of our character, that we should be able to do that. But I knew in a sense that there's a piece of the story always missing, which is what are people able to do for themselves, and how are we able to develop the agency of every one of those people to become the answer to the problem and to experience their own possibilities. And it's always a very tense shift of perspective, because we don't want to lose our sense of responsibility for people who are vulnerable, and yet we don't want to lose our sense of respect for knowing their capabilities if they had the right conditions. So it's living in that tension, really, that we discovered again, the neighbourhood parliaments and what Nathaniel was doing. And even though I knew before that that was happening, I hadn't ever seen it as clearly, that this new neighbourhood level of self-organization, which was already well developed in India, is being replicated here, you know, in North London, for goodness sakes, as a new thing, a neighbourhood, suddenly a new connection between people in a neighbourhood through technology. This is what we describe and think of as fractal shift and fractal growth, new patterns of behaviour. And with the technology we have, this knowledge of the capacity of the human being and the agency of people in relationship with each other is the very thing that can change the story about what kind of a future we can begin to develop together. So I know we're coming to the end of the session, and if anybody else would like to still make a comment, we're happy to stay for another few minutes. If anybody wants to, yeah, Raymond, if you want to say something.
Unmute, Raymond. Yeah, cool. Okay. Oh. You're unmuted, Raymond.
Am I unmuted now? Can you
yeah, you're fine.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I apologize. I have to go to another meeting. I'm going on to meet the Jack to talk about sanitation and hygiene and whatever sort of stuff. thrilled. I've made copious notes here about everything you were talking about, and I'd love to come back at some stage and continue the relationship. I'm just, my simple consideration is some of these chasms that we're trying to cross are very vast from the high up levels, and we've seen the rise of new dictatorships in close countries, but even communities talking to local governments. I grew up as a child of the 50s and 60s, and there was community, and we could talk to people, and the police were there, and local politicians were there, and we could vex and vent our emotions to people, type of stuff. That's gone. Even now, the closest I got to community was going out last Thursday night and clapping my hands for NHS. And that's the first time I felt part of my community for some time. We're all transient. We're all leaving for work early in the morning and coming home at night and spending more time in our cars and shops, whatever. I absolutely 100% agree. This is about people. The country should be run by people. The politicians should know what we want, what we need to survive. We don't need high-speed trains. We don't need aircraft carriers. We don't need to give people £300 million or give India £90 billion a year. We need to spend that money on our communities. We need to spend it on community centres, on public toilets, obviously, which is my remit, sort of stuff, health, education, well-being. But how we're going to cross those divides, I don't know. But I'll be interested to debate it sometime in the future.
Yeah, and do join us and see what is happening in places you might least expect.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, so I think that's coming to a natural end of our call, and thank you very much indeed for being on there with us, and hope to see you again sometime in this virtual space. Goodbye.
Goodbye now.
Bye-bye.